Okay, so you've given us a whole bunch of slides here about urban land use models. Someone's been doing their homework.
Looks like someone's interested in how cities tick.
Right. And who can blame them? It's
Uh-huh.
fascinating stuff. We're basically talking about the DNA of a city, how it grows, why people live where they do, all that.
Yeah, it's like figuring out why that new coffee shop popped up on that corner and not the one across the street.
Exactly. And the cool thing is we have all these different models to help us understand it.
Each one's like a different lens to view the city through.
I like that. And we've got quite the collection of lenses here, some from way back, some more recent.
Yeah, we'll go from the very first theories to the cutting edge stuff. It's amazing to see how those early ideas, even the ones just about basic economics or transportation, how those sparked the more complex models we use now.
It's all connected. All right, let's rewind the clock way back to 1826. First up, the von Thünen model. Now, this one's about agricultural land, which might seem a bit out of place.
But that's where it all began. And you'd be surprised, the von Thünen model, even though it focuses on farms, it reveals a principle that pops up everywhere, in every city, even today.
Okay, now you've got me curious.
So picture this. A central market square, the heart of a town. Von Thünen was a farmer himself, and he knew that the land closest to that market, that was the most valuable.
Because it was closer to all the customers.
That and transportation costs. Think about it. If you're a farmer, it's way cheaper and faster to get your goods to market if your farm is right next door.
Makes sense. Less time on the road, less spoilage, all that.
Exactly. And that simple idea that proximity equals value that leads to these rings, these concentric rings of different types of farming. The most profitable stuff like dairy, fruits, things that spoil easily, those need to be closest to the market. Further out, you get to grains, livestock, things that can handle a longer journey.
So it's like a target, with the bullseye being the prime real estate.
You got it. And the further out you go, the less intensive the land use. But hold on, here's where it gets interesting. This same principle applies to cities.
Wait, really? How so?
Think about it. In a city, where are the most expensive places to live? Usually right in the center, close to jobs, restaurants, entertainment. It's all about minimizing that commute, just like farmers minimizing their trip to the market.
Wow, you're right. I never thought about it like that.
It's all connected. And this brings us to our next model, the Burgess model from 1925. This time, we're shifting focus from fields to the city itself.
Hit me with it. What's the Burgess model all about?
Well, Burgess, he was looking at Chicago in the roaring 20s.
The Jazz Age.
Exactly. And he noticed that, just like those rings around von Thünen's market, cities also grow outward from a center point. He called this the Central Business District, or CBD. The heart of the action.
So instead of fields of wheat, we have skyscrapers and bustling streets.
Precisely. The closer you are to that CBD, the more valuable the land, because everyone wants to be where the action is. And this, again, leads to those familiar rings, but this time they're made up of different zones.
Okay, so the CBD is like the bullseye. What about the rings around it?
Right, so right next to the CBD, you often find what they call a zone in transition. This is where you might find a mix of things, maybe some older housing, light industry, that kind of thing.
A bit more gritty, a bit more, shall we say, character?
Yeah, you could say that. Then as you move further out, you get to the working class residential areas. And finally, on the outskirts, you get those suburbs.
It's like a snapshot of a city frozen in time. But hold on a second. Cities aren't always that neat and tidy, are they?
You're telling me. They're messy, they're dynamic, they're constantly changing. And that's where our next model comes in. In 1939, Homer Hoyt took the Burgess model and said, hold on, we're forgetting something crucial.
And that something was?
Transportation. He realized those rivers, railways, those big roads connecting everything, they don't just get you from point A to point B, they shape how a city grows. He called his idea the Hoyt model, also known as the sector model, and it helps explain why cities don't always look like those perfect bullseyes.
So are you saying cities grow in like wedges or something?
Exactly. Think of it this way. Imagine a beautiful river running through a city. Where do you think the wealthy folks want to build their houses?
With a waterfront view, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you get this wedge of wealthy housing stretching outward from the CBD along the river. Or think about a major railway line. You often see industrial zones popping up along those routes because it's easy to transport goods.
It's like those transportation lines are arteries, pumping life into different parts of the city.
Precisely. It's not just about distance from the center anymore. It's about access and connections.
This is making me look at city maps in a whole new light.
Right. And it makes you realize that a simple map can tell you so much about a city's history, how it's grown and developed over time.
It's like a hidden language. Okay, we've gone from farms to bullseyes to wedges. What's next in our urban planning time machine?
All right, get ready for a real curveball. In 1945, Harris and Ullman, they came along and said, hold on a sec, cities don't always follow the rules.
Yeah.
They came up with the multiple nuclei model, and it really shook things up.
Okay, shook things up usually means way more realistic when it comes to these models.
Right. They realized cities don't just grow from a single center like those neat little rings we talked about.
Yeah.
Instead, they saw all these different centers of growth popping up, and they called them nuclei.
Nuclei, like in a cell.
Exactly. Think of a university campus. It attracts student housing, bookstores, maybe a whole bunch of those, quirky coffee shops. That's a nucleus. Or an airport. You get hotels, logistics centers, maybe even some manufacturing, all clustered around it.
So instead of one giant bullseye, you have a city with like a bunch of little bullseyes, each with its own kind of gravity.
Exactly. And those nuclei, they interact with each other. Sometimes they compete, sometimes they complement each other. And it creates a city that's much more like a mosaic than a simple target.
Okay, this is making my own city's layout make so much more sense. I'm picturing the financial district, the university area, even that hip neighborhood with all the art galleries. Those are like nuclei.
See, it's everywhere once you start looking for it. It's a much more, organic way to think about how cities grow, how they change over time.
Totally agree. So we've talked about agriculture, the central business district, and how transportation plays a role. What else did these urban planning detectives figure out?
Well, here's the thing. Up until this point, we've mostly been thinking about those physical forces, the economics of it all. But in 1965, this guy, F. Stewart Chapin Jr., he came along and said, hey, we're forgetting something really important. Decisions, choices, public policy.
Oh, right. Like governments have a say in how cities grow too, right? Zoning laws where they decide to build new roads, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Chapin's model, and they called it the Chapin model, no surprise there, but it really drove home the point that land use isn't just about, rivers and hills and economics. It's about the choices that city planners make, the policies they put in place. Even residents themselves have a say in how their neighborhoods develop.
So it's not just about where the river flows or where the cheapest land is. It's also about things like zoning laws, where they invest in public transportation. Even things like where they decide to put a new park or build affordable housing.
You got it. Think about your own community for a second. Have you ever seen them build a new park and suddenly that whole area just seems to come alive?
Yeah, or a new light rail line that connects a neighborhood to downtown, and all of a sudden you see new businesses popping up along the route. It's amazing.
It's like those decisions, they have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
They shape not just what a city looks like, but how it feels, how people experience it. And it can make a city more livable, more equitable, or it can, unfortunately, make those inequalities even worse.
That's a really important point. It's not just about understanding how cities grow. It's about using that knowledge to make them better for everyone.
Exactly. And this whole idea, this focus on decision-making, that was a big turning point in urban planning. It set the stage for even more sophisticated models, ones that considered even more factors like technology, the environment, all sorts of things.
Okay, so we've gone from farms to bullseyes to wedges to these multi-centered cities, and now we're adding in like the human element, the choices that shape those patterns. It's like we keep zooming in, getting a closer and closer look at the inner workings of a city.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And just when you think you've got it all figured out, we're going to zoom in even further.
Do tell. What comes next in our urban planning journey? Okay, so we've journeyed from farmland to skyscrapers, from simple rings to cities that sprawl in every direction. I'm ready for the grand finale. What did these later urban planning models bring to the table?
Well, one thing they really drove home is that there's no one-size-fits-all model for how cities grow. They started looking at, different parts of the world, different cultures, and realized that what works for Chicago might not work for Tokyo or Rio de Janeiro.
Makes sense. Cities are like people. They each have their own personality, their own unique history.
Right, and those histories, those cultures, they're baked into the city's DNA. Take, for example, the Griffin-Ford model. Developed in the 1960s, they were looking at Latin American cities.
Okay, and what did they find? Were those cities shaped like bullseyes or wedges or?
Not exactly. They found a mix of things. It's like they took those earlier models, the concentric zones, the sectors, and added a twist. Imagine a city with a historic colonial core, often with a plaza at its center. Now picture elite residential sectors radiating out from that core, often following major roads or those desirable waterfront locations. That's the signature element of the Griffin-Ford model.
So it's like those colonial avenues, they became the spines of the city, attracting the wealthy and influential, while other areas may be developed differently.
Exactly. And this model, it doesn't shy away from the fact that these patterns often reflect social and economic divides, with lower income residents sometimes pushed to the periphery or into informal settlements.
It's like those historical patterns, they continue to shape the city's growth, even centuries later.
Powerful stuff. Now let's hop over to Southeast Asia. We've got the McGee model, also from the 1960s. McGee, he found that these cities, they often had a colonial past too, but their growth patterns were totally different.
Oh, how so?
Picture a city with a port, often established by colonial powers, and that port becomes a magnet for commerce, for activity, and from there, you see sectors of development radiating outward, almost like the arms of a starfish.
A starfish city. Okay, that's a new one.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike those Western models, where the suburbs are often where the wealthy folks live, in many Southeast Asian cities, it's the opposite.
You mean the wealthy live closer to the center?
Often, yeah. The middle and upper classes, they often cluster closer to that city center, while newer migrants and lower income residents might be found further out. It's all about access to those economic opportunities, those social networks.
Fascinating. It shows how important it is to consider the specific cultural and economic forces at play. What about Africa? What were urban planners seeing there?
The African city model.
Hmm.
This one's a real challenge to those traditional models. You see, African cities, they experienced rapid urbanization, often coupled with the legacies of colonialism, and it created some incredibly unique and complex urban forms.
So not quite rings, wedges, or even starfish.
Not even close. Imagine a city with multiple centers of activity, each one reflecting a different period of development or a different cultural influence. You might have a colonial CBD right next to a traditional market area, and then a little further out, a rapidly growing informal settlement, all coexisting within the same city.
It's like a city with multiple personalities, each one trying to find its place.
Exactly. And for urban planners working in African cities, navigating those complexities, that's the name of the game.
Wow. We've gone from farms to skyscrapers, from concentric rings to starfish cities. It's incredible how these models help us appreciate the sheer diversity of cities around the world.
It's mind-boggling, really.
Yeah.
And as we look to the future, a future shaped by technology, by climate change, by all these global forces, these models, they're going to have to evolve even further.
Right. It's not just about understanding where a city has been. It's about, well, almost predicting where it's going.
Precisely. And we're already seeing models that incorporate things like big data, artificial intelligence. They're trying to understand how people move, how they interact, almost in real time.
It's like those first models, the ones about transportation and economics, they were just the tip of the iceberg. Now we're diving deep into human behavior, technology, the future of our planet.
And we're just getting started. It's an exciting time to be thinking about cities, about how they work, how they're changing.
It certainly is. You've given us a lot to think about today. From rural farms to bustling megacities, from simple diagrams to models that feel like they're on the verge of predicting the future, it's been an incredible journey through the evolution of urban planning. Any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
Just this. The next time you're walking through a city or looking at a map, take a moment to think about those invisible forces that have shaped it. The decisions, the accidents of history, the geography, it's all there, written in the streets and buildings.
I love that. It's like every city is a living, breathing storybook, just waiting to be explored. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into urban land use models. A huge thanks to our expert for joining us today and for sharing these incredible insights. And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep imagining the cities of the future.